I guess we'll start in Bristol with you, Tony. Your thoughts on, not just Boris Johnson's. He's been pretty adamant that he could get this thing done, and he said there was 100 ways to do this to protect both Britain's concerns and the European Union's, but it seems like no one's really listening. Your thoughts?
Well, look, can I just correct some facts? Because that's what's needed here. Saying that the Good Friday Agreement does not allow a border, well, that's just simply not true. I've had a look at the Good Friday Agreement, signed in the late 1990s with the help of Mo Mowlam, Tony Blair, and it brought the troubles, which have been going on for 25 years, to an end. And actually the text of that does talk about border security. The only section which refers to border security talks about the removal of security installations consistent with the level of threat. So what that is talking about is the dismantling of the army watchtowers and the army facilities, which were a day-to-day check at that border. Now, I had the good fortune of living in Northern Ireland, very close to the border in County Fermanagh and with Cavan in Southern Ireland, just across the way at the time. And I can tell you, it was an extremely draconian and difficult process to get through that border. The army were everywhere. Sometimes they'd be hiding, lying flat in the fields as you were going past because they were not sure if there was going to be a terrorist attack at the time. So the Good Friday Agreement's actual wording is about reducing the border to a normal border level. It's nothing to do with getting rid of the border completely. This is really, I think, a Trojan horse, this whole a backstop that's been put in there. And it's really, the idea really is because people have other agendas than peace. It's nothing to do with peace, and it's nothing to do with looking at what the British people have voted for in 2016 to leave the European Union. It's because they want a united Ireland. And of course the Irish government want this, and the EU have picked up on this whole issue simply because they can see that it's a major potential problem between the Irish Republic and the UK. So somebody needs to actually know, journalists in Britain seem to have actually gone to look at the Good Friday Agreement and see what it says. Removal of security installations consistent with the level of threat. Now, that doesn't mean getting rid of the border, and that's what they're trying to imply here. And that actually, I think this is what this is really about, is to get a united Ireland out of this. And of course, there's a major faction in Northern Ireland, that is to say Sinn Féin and the Republican movement, the nationalist movement in Northern Ireland, that is very much liking this way things are going, because they're making it difficult for the unionists in Northern Ireland, and they're making it very difficult for the British. But Boris Johnson has seen right through all this, thank goodness. He was one of those who last July was involved, he was Foreign Secretary, if you remember, at the point where the backstop was introduced by Theresa May, and he and David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, resigned on principle. They said this backstop is never going to work, and they were absolutely right. Now, one of the things that came out when May resigned was that her husband, Philip May, had been doing most of the actual negotiations with Conservative MPs. So Conservative MPs were finding it impossible to get through to Theresa May herself. They were being put through on the phone to Philip May, her husband. Now, he was actually one of the people involved in the negotiations himself. Well, he shouldn't have been, of course. He's only the husband of the Prime Minister. He shouldn't have been a negotiator. But he is a fund manager for Capital Group in the United States, a massive, massive investment fund who own the major shares in BAE Systems, one of the biggest British arms companies, and also a major investor in Lockheed, the United States arms company. So what we actually had during the Theresa May Prime Ministership was somebody from the US and British arms industry conducting the negotiations with Brussels. And that's what I hope Boris will be able to get past, and we'll now see some genuine negotiations going on from this point.
And James, your thoughts on this?
Well, firstly, I think it vindicates Boris Johnson's strategy in these negotiations, because he said that by putting no deal back on the table and making no deal a possibility again, which Theresa May had ruled out, he could get the EU to shift on the backstop issue, which which they have to do if there's going to be a deal. And it's not up to Boris Johnson. The problem is that the backstop was so unpopular that the deal couldn't pass through Parliament even after 3 votes. Now, it also kind of pulls the rug from under the Labour Party's strategy here, which is to say that Boris Johnson's negotiating tactics would lead inevitably to a no-deal Brexit, and that a no-deal Brexit is a disaster, which in fact it isn't, or certainly the people who voted to leave don't care about, and that therefore all sorts of extraordinary things have to be done to try and stop this, including having a no-confidence motion in the government and then setting up a kind of national government in between the Labour Party and members of the Conservative Party and all the opposition parties, all the other opposition parties, which the last time we did that was in 1931, and it was a disaster. Right. What can I say further? The Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement was about having peace in Northern Ireland. It was about the paramilitaries laying down their arms, the paramilitary forces on both sides of the divide laying down their arms. As for free movement between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, that is guaranteed by the Common Travel Area, which is a series of treaties that date back almost 100 years, certainly a lot longer than the EU has even existed. Those treaties are bilateral, they're not dependent on the EU, and even if the EU somehow forced... Wait, can you stop that? Somehow forced Ireland to revoke those treaties, it would be the Irish government probably wouldn't do it because it would be extremely unpopular. There are something like 1 million Irish citizens living in the living in the UK, freely and able to work here because of the Common Travel Area. So these things are unlikely. What they're talking about is the movement of goods. And most goods that move between the UK and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, or vice versa, go by sea or by air, and therefore encounter a hard border because they arrive at ports and they have to be checked. And if the Republic of Ireland was moving goods to other EU countries, it could simply fly them to EU airports in the EU or sail them to ports in the EU. So it doesn't become such a big problem. So, yeah.
And now, Tony, if we want to perhaps entertain this narrative that the EU perhaps got over on Theresa May by getting her to accept this backstop issue, take it to Parliament where it got thrice rejected, where does this leave Boris Johnson now? How does he undo this thing with the little time he has left, or does he?
Well, I think he's got all sorts of potential problems here in the UK, that is to say, domestically, within Parliament particularly, and some within his own party who don't want to see him succeed in removing us from the European Union. Look, James just mentioned the movement of goods in the EU. Actually, the fact of the matter is it's goods, services and people. That's what the single market, that's what the European Free Trade Area is all about. And I would suggest we concentrate on the way that people are seen the same as goods and services. This, to me, is typical EU. What they're saying is basically, well, this is a way of moving labour around, and people are just labour, and they are just, valuable for their economic use. And this is, I don't think, in any way, the way borders should work. We should be looking at people, well, does someone want to travel there? Do they want to come and move? And also, there don't seem to be any interest in whether somebody is there for the right good intentions or whether they're part of some sort of organised crime network. So the idea that you can treat goods and services and people all the same is exactly the sort of two-dimensional thinking we've been getting for years from the EU. Also, the European Commission, what do they say? They're always telling us great things that they've done, but actually I think that they are fraudulent. I mean, look at, for example, one of the things they were saying was that they were equality throughout the European Union is really important. Then what happens is the various member states are allowed to ban face coverings. which of course affects Muslims more than anybody else, and, by the way, is a wonderful bonus for the tech giants like Facebook who want to introduce, facial recognition software, the police that want to introduce facial recognition software. So the EU is just going along with that. After the 2008 banking crisis, the EU did virtually nothing. They say that they want to try to get rid of tax havens. And then what do? The biggest tax haven, or the most important tax haven in Europe, which is Luxembourg, they put the former finance minister of Luxembourg and Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker in charge of the European Commission, made him European Commission president. That is to say, the president of Europe is the guy who's been in charge of the most important and devious tax haven in the whole of the continent. So the actual reality is completely different from the words that we're hearing. But, I mean, getting back to your point about what's going to happen now, I think we're going to see some nasty surprises. It's almost like electric shocks between now and the end of the end of October. Halloween, which is no coincidence. This horrible date, the rising up of the dead, supposedly. I mean, this is all superstition, but to have this on the same day as the Britain leaves the EU with no deal, supposedly, I think what we'll be seeing is all sorts of problems happening in the immediate run-up to that from the financial sector. Because the financial system, Goldman Sachs and these other big banks, and particularly the Bank for International Settlements, the big Swiss banks, have wanted to see a unified Europe under their political control, which is effectively what Brussels has become. And they will not like any kind of successful Brexit, because that sends a message out, particularly to Italy and Greece. There are two countries on the verge of dying to leave the EU, that it can be done successfully. And that really will be the end for Brussels. If Britain leaves successfully, other countries will be also trying to leave the sinking ship.